Hi everyone, welcome. I am Catherine West and I'm here to welcome you to today's symposium, Oceans Past, Present and Future, Historical Ecology and Circumpolar Fisheries Management, which is sponsored by Boston University's Pardee Center for the Study of the Longer Range Future. And I'd like to start by thanking John Prandato, Mike Etnier, and Trevor Lamb for helping me to organize this event. And I'd also like to acknowledge two former directors of the Pardee Center, Tony Genetos and Cynthia Bearcat, who gave us the initial funding for this event and had the wisdom to see that the past really is useful for understanding the future. So as you can see in the slide that we're sharing here, today's symposium will start now with our keynote address, followed by an interdisciplinary panel discussion this afternoon at 3 o'clock Eastern Time. And I am so pleased to welcome our keynote speaker. Dr. Loren McClenachan is joining us from Colby College in Maine, where she is the Elizabeth and Lee Ainslie Professor of Environmental Studies. And Dr. McClenachan is an interdisciplinary scholar. She draws on natural science, social science, and humanities to understand long-term ecological change and its present-day conservation benefits. So for those of you who are listening, Loren will talk for about 40 minutes, and we encourage you to post your questions to the chat while she's talking, and John and I will compile those for discussion when she's finished. So welcome, Loren. We're just delighted to have you here to kick off our symposium.
Great, thank you very much. It's a real honor to present today my talk, Oceans Past, Present and Future. I'll be talking about historical ecology and shifting baselines in fisheries. But I wanted to start off by talking about polar species interactions actually on land. So the ecological interaction between the snowshoe hare and the Canadian lynx shown here is perhaps among one of the most well-known in ecology, with graphs like this in the upper corner appearing in virtually every undergraduate ecology textbook. So the 10-year periodicity and abundance of these two species was really key in understanding the population cycles of predator-prey interactions, which is one of the most fundamental concepts in modern ecology. But how do we have this information? Were there ecologists in 1840 and 1850 recording the interactions of these species? No, we know about these species because of their fur. Their pelts were traded by 18th and 19th century colonists, such as is shown in this picture here of a pelt trader in northern Alberta in the 1890s. We can see a variety of different mammal species that have been caught and are on their way to be sold. This was really big business, and records like this were kept by the Hudson Bay Company, documenting the number of animals traded. So I'm showing you here an image of the inside of the Hudson Bay Company archive, and then the inside of one of these books with one of the pages documenting trade on a particular day in the 1820s. These records were first published as ecological data in 1921 in a book called The Conservation of the Wildlife of Canada. And so I'm showing you here the cover of that, as well as a screenshot of the page where these data first appeared. So you can see rabbit on the top and lynx on the bottom. And this book is full of other graphs like this for other mammals that were traded in this time period. So these were first published in 1921, and then they were further explored by ecologists in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. So in fact, now we have records going back to 1740 documenting similar cyclical patterns in the number of pelts sold, which are accepted as a proxy of abundance over these long timescales. So the point here is that historical archival data have been central to understanding fundamental concepts in ecology. And we wouldn't have been able to make these observations without historical data. And these data, which again are trade records of numbers of pelts sold, have been absorbed and accepted as proxies of abundance among ecologists for a century, since the 1920s. So what does this have to do with fish? So similar trade existed for many species of marine fish, including Atlantic cod, which is shown here, dried and baled and ready for sale in Maine in that same time period in the 1890s. But the realization that historical data have value for ocean ecology has been more recent. So the field that I work in, historical marine ecology, developed in the early 2000s out of a realization that these types of records were in fact useful to understanding ocean ecology and long-term change in coastal ecosystems. So this paper, published 20 years ago now in 2001, Historical Overfishing and the Recent Collapse of Coastal ecosystems really jump-started this field and the idea that we should be looking back farther in time to understand the coastal dynamics that we're seeing today. This field was also responding to fisheries crises that were happening in the 1990s, such as the collapse of Atlantic cod in maritime Canada in 1991 and the subsequent moratorium in 1992, which effectively ended a centuries-long industry that was the backbone of the culture and the economies of this place. And it also, I think, led to a larger realization that humans could impact fish populations and ecosystems on this larger scale, which made it important to understand this longer term change in a way that wasn't previously acknowledged. So in the 1990s and early 2000s, I think there was a real shift in the public perception of the ability of humans to impact fish populations on a global scale. So for example, this Newsweek cover asked the question, are the oceans dying? And it was reporting on the well-known Myers and Worm paper that documented a 90% decline in a suite of pelagic fish since the 1950s. And I personally have a strong connection with this particular moment in time because I read this issue of Newsweek on an airplane as I was traveling to Southern California to begin my PhD work that was looking at long-term change in marine ecosystems. So since then, the field of ecology has developed, and it's been clear that historical records are as useful in the ocean as they were on land. So for instance, schooners, such as I'm showing you here, that were part of the Beverly, Massachusetts fleet, kept daily log records and catch and effort data, which are shown here in this graph that shows the estimates of hundreds of fish caught per day. Were analyzed using methods associated with fisheries stock assessments to derive the absolute abundance of cod on the Scotian shelf in the 1850s. So the results that there were 1.26 million metric tons of cod on the Scotian shelf in 1852, shown here in the upper right with the blue dot, puts the trends that exist over the last several decades, shown in the bottom with the red line, into stark contrast. So there was an order of magnitude more fish in the ocean a century ago. So absolute abundance can be derived from historical records and is important, but historical ecology has also shown lots of different types of change, such as a loss of spatial complexity. So before depletion, fish were caught in bays and along the Maine with scenes that looked like this. So we see a picture of Atlantic cod caught off Monhegan Island in this small boat, and the second picture shows Atlantic cod drying on docks in Frenchman's Bay. So strikingly, no cod have been caught in many of these inshore bays for more than a decade. And other sources of historical data, such as fisheries logbooks that show a diversity of locations fished. So for example, this is work done by Karen Alexander and others at the University of New Hampshire, looking at Gulf of Maine cod in 1861. And the image here is showing you a diversity of different places that were fished at this time period. And so they calculated an average distance from port of 24 kilometers, as opposed to an average distance of more than 100 today. So this spatial complexity reflected in the ways that people fish in the fishing grounds. This loss of complexity in the fishery also translates to a loss of ecological complexity. So Ted Ames, who is a retired fisherman turned scientist whose work has earned him a MacArthur Genius Award, is one of the key figures in documenting this change. So I'm showing you here an image from one of his papers that looks at changes to cod spawning grounds inshore in the Gulf of Maine. And it's shown here in red in this map. And so his work has shown that half of the coastal spawning grounds have simply disappeared. So together, both these surveys of retired fishermen and historical documents point to a loss of discrete cod populations and an overall loss of spatial complexity for this species. Historical records have also shown a loss of ecological complexity. So these massive inshore cod populations were supported by productive food webs that included herring, menhaden, and clams, among other things. And these also supported small-scale diversified fisheries. So Karen Alexander, who's been really important in this work in this part of the world, said, to me, the most amazing thing we've learned is how incredibly productive these inshore banks were. So historical records therefore document wholesale ecological change. So today, this ecological simplification in the Gulf of Maine has left the Maine coast lobster rich. So this is a picture of a single lobster boat and hundreds of lobster buoys, which are thick around the waters of the island that I live on in the Gulf of Maine. So the lobster fishery completely dominates the coastal waters of Maine, and it's a really big business. It's the largest by value in the US. Lobster also dominates the culture of the Maine coast. So here we celebrate the fishery through festivals and a tourism industry that directly links to this ongoing and lucrative fishery. But this shift in dominance from cod to lobster happened relatively recently, at least in contrast to this longer history that I started off telling you about. So as we can see here, there was a shift to lobster dominance only beginning in the 1990s. So you remember maybe that I started off talking about the decline of cod in maritime Canada happening in 1991 and 1992. The timeline here was quite similar, just a couple of years later. And so as we can see, the 1980s was really the last decade that cod could be caught in Maine, with this rapid ascendancy of lobster happening over that same time period. So with this history in mind, and also because of pandemic travel restrictions this summer keeping us in the state boundaries of Maine, my family and I made use of the resources that we had, namely our family sailboat here, and embarked on a small research expedition, which asked the question, what do fishermen in the Gulf of Maine think of as natural? When do they think the Gulf of Maine was natural, and what species do they think of as associated with a natural Gulf of Maine? So we interviewed fishermen on offshore islands like this one I'm showing you here and along the Maine coast over the course of the summer. And so we asked the question, when was the Gulf of Maine natural? And I'm showing you here the average response that we got to this question, with that date being reflected relative to the year that each person started fishing. So we can see that some identified a natural Gulf of Maine more than 100 years ago. So 2 of the responses that we got indicated that, with the longest one being more than 500 years relative to the date that the fishing began for this person. Others identified a date after they started fishing, as we can see everything above the 0 mark here on the axis, with the most extreme being 16 years after that person started fishing. But on average, baseline dates were about a decade before the start of a person's fishing career, so 11 years on average. And this corresponds to an age of 12 among the people that we talked about, so that we talked to. So this sort of makes sense, that people form the idea of what is natural in the environment that they know well at the beginning of their adult life. It's sort of the beginning of these teenage years. And this is what we found here as well. We also asked the question, what made the Gulf of Maine natural? And I'm showing you here the data that I just showed you in an aggregated way with the individual baseline views. So the year that each person started fishing along the top connected to the year that the person told us that they thought the Gulf of Maine was natural, the baseline date for that person. So some connected cod to a natural Gulf of Maine, having the sense that this cod fishery had this longer term history. So the 2 folks who identified very long baselines were doing so because of cod. They were identifying the development of early European cod fisheries, and then the development of canneries in particular parts of Maine. So the development of this export-driven cod fishery was closely associated with these longer term views of the Gulf of Maine as natural. However, the largest number of people considered the Gulf of Maine to be natural in the 1970s and 1980s. So 60% of the people that we talked to identified the 1970s and the 1980s. And these folks had memories of the tail end of this productive cod fishery that I just talked to you about. And fishermen reported that the development of mobile trawling gear for cod, as well as for herring fisheries after this in the 1980s and 1990s, and the associated consolidation of licenses, which effectively ended the smaller scale diversified fisheries that had existed before this, as being a marker of the end of a natural Gulf of Maine. And then finally, others, primarily newer fishermen, seem to lack this longer term memory, or specifically lack an association of baselines in the Gulf of Maine with cod at all. Many of the baseline Vs were associated instead with changes that happened in the lobster fishery. So in an increasing size of lobster boats over the course of the last decade and a half or so, and the growth of the fishery that's moving slightly more offshore. And so it's clear that memories of cod seem to be fading, particularly among newer fishermen. And this matters because memories also seem to dictate future desires. So we also asked people to quantify their perceived past abundances and desired future abundances for a suite of key species, which I'm showing you here. Perceived past being shown in black and desired future being shown in gray. And so we can see that for a majority of these species, for cod, herring, halibut, and whales, there's a really close match between what people perceive to have existed in the past and what they desire for the future, with cod and herring both being perceived as abundant and desired in the future, and halibut and whales both being perceived as slightly more abundant, but mostly always rare in this part of the world. We also found that economic value dictates future desires as well. So the two species that didn't adhere to this were alewives and lobster. Lobster fishermen acknowledged that the populations of lobster are currently at an all-time high and wanted this to continue in the future, or at least not crash in the future. And the other species that didn't adhere to this was alewives. And alewives are caught primarily for bait in the lobster fishery and are perceived to have only been slightly more abundant in the past, but are desired to be a lot more abundant in the future with restoration efforts that are happening throughout these watersheds. So I think what this points to is that cultural memory interacts with economic value to define future desires for marine ecosystems. And in this case, the question is, what species are natural, with memories of cod perhaps fading among people who don't have that connection to the fishery of the 1970s and the 1980s, and lobster coming in as a species that's perceived to be associated with the current and future Gulf of Maine. And this cultural memory matters particularly when that change has been substantial. So I started off by talking about the 90% decline in cod biomass since the 1850s. And so the loss of memory of this, I think, is important in thinking about the future of these ecosystems. So the North Atlantic is a place where fish really matter, and where fish have really mattered for a long time, that they're closely associated with the history of this place. But there's lots of other places that fish matter. And so I want to take us now to another place that has a close connection to fish, which is the Florida Keys. So I've spent the majority of my career so far as a historical ecologist working in archives that look something like this. And so I began my PhD by traveling to archives throughout the US, in Europe, and in the Caribbean, looking for anything that could really inform our understanding of long-term change to coral reef ecosystems. And I was focused on the Caribbean and the Florida Keys. And so I would go into archives and I would look through boxes of things that look like this, and I would talk to archivists and ask what sort of documents exist that I might be able to have a look at. And in actually the last place I visited in the Florida Keys at the Monroe County Public Library in Key West, I came across a box of photos like this one here. So this is an example of a picture that was part of a collection in a box that looked like this. And I was really excited when I saw this because I could tell that there was something there, that these photos contained ecological data that could be pulled out. So there's high resolution data on the size structure, so we can get a sense for the size structure of these fish, as well as the species, able to identify species from these photos. And importantly, this was consistently collected information since the 1950s. So there was a photographer whose name was Charlie Anderson. He would go down to the docks each day. In the days before everybody had a cell phone in their pockets or a digital camera on them, his business was to take photos for tourists. And these were fish that were caught by tourists on recreational fishing boats in Key West. And so he would take a photo, he would mail it off to the tourists, and he kept a copy for himself. And when he passed away, he donated them to the public library, which is where I came across them. So I'm showing you here that same picture from the last slide. It's the front and the back of one of these photos, and you can see maybe the date stamp there that says July 20th, 1956. So really good metadata here on these photos. Okay, so what do we see when we look at these pictures? What sort of ecological information pops out? So this is a picture from early on in that time series from 1958. These were fish that were caught on the boat called the Gulf Stream. You can see from the sign there. This was one of 2 boats that operated consistently over this 50-year time period. The large fish that dominate this picture are called Goliath grouper. If you count them, there's something like 16 individual Goliath grouper in this picture. And you can get a sense for their size maybe by the rather large reef shark that's lying down next to them on the ground. So a whole lot of fish biomass coming out of the water on this particular day in 1958. This is a picture from the same year, from 1958. This is the other boat, the Greyhound, and we can see a number of large groupers in this picture as well. Looks like a really lovely day out fishing. Moving forward in time now by a couple of decades, this is now 1979. We can see the large Goliath grouper off to the side. There's also a number of different species here, reef-associated pelagic fish that come in seasonally to these reefs. For example, cobia, which are the black fish in the center of that picture. Moving now to the 1980s, we're starting to see the pictures become colorized, and we're starting to see a shift in the fish as well. So there's some grouper, but there's also hogfish and snappers and other predatory fish as well. So when we look at these photos over time, the not so hidden history lesson, I think, pops out, which is that the size of the fish has changed and our expectations for them has changed as well. This is also something that is quantifiable. And so I measured the fish in the photos and found an average decline of 50% in the length of these fish over this 50-year time period. And then when you scale that for weight, it becomes a 90% decline in the weight of these large trophy fish over this time scale. And this is important here because memories are short as well in this part of the world. So Goliath grouper, which I mentioned as I was talking through those photos, is a fish that's been under discussion for a while, for a couple of decades. The fishery was closed in 1990 in response to the measured decline in these populations. And there has been a lobby to reopen that fishery for the last decade and a half, essentially. And so this is a newspaper article from 2010, which I think captures the perception of this. So the fisheries, the populations are starting to recover locally, which is great, but the perception is that they've recovered to the extent that they're becoming a nuisance. And that there's more now than I've ever seen in my lifetime is the other quote that I've highlighted here. And so in the absence of this longer term memory, this cultural memory of the abundances just a generation ago, this becomes the dominant narrative in defining the future of this species in this ecosystem. So I think we can say here too that cultural memory directs desires for abundances. So in the North Atlantic, we're thinking about the species that are natural as we're shifting from cod to lobster. And here we're thinking about the abundances that are natural as we're assessing the status of recovery for this particular species. So now, essentially 20 years into the development of the field of historical ecology, I think we have a deep body of research on long-term change to marine fish populations. So I'm showing you here a number of screenshots of papers that have been published that show similar types of change to the examples that I've been talking through. There's also a great network of people that are thinking about this. The Oceans Pass Network, for example, hosts a conference each year. And so there's lots of people all over the world thinking about how to measure long-term change in fish populations. And across these different types of research, we've seen declines in several different metrics. So for example, declines in fish biomass, the example of the 90% decline in cod biomass since the 1850s in New England, declines in fish size, so the 90% decline in the size of predatory fish since the 1950s in Florida, and declines in fish catch rate. So Ruth Thurston is somebody who's done a whole bunch of really great work in the field of historical ecology, and some of her work in Australia has shown a 90% decline in snapper catch rates since the 1870s, and importantly, an agreement among different sources that this decline is consistently shown. So across these different geographies, across these different species, and across these different metrics, we find really consistent degrees of decline, which is put really nicely, I think, by the Canadian journalist James McKinnon. And he said that historical data show that we're living in a 10% world. So the world that we think of as natural is reduced by about an order of magnitude of what it was when we look in the past. And this is important because this memory loss is codified into management. So Renee Prefontaine, who was an undergraduate student at Dalhousie University in 2009, undertook a study that looked at the stock assessments housed in the Ram-Myers Legacy Stock Assessment database. And she found something that I found to be quite surprising, which is that about a third of the stock assessments that were housed in this database had experienced data truncation, meaning that previously used data from the earliest dates in a time series had been excluded. And she found this to be pretty extensive. So on average, a quarter century of early data were discarded, about 24 years. And this truncation results in lost knowledge about a variety of things about marine fish, for example, natural variability. So one example of a population that experienced this was Icelandic cod, shown here. In this case, 27 years of data were truncated, taking the time series from 83 years to 55 years. And importantly, this truncation lost information on the maximum spawning spot biomass for this species. So we've lost information about natural fluctuations and the natural variability in these populations. And this information on natural fluctuations has implications for management targets. So one well-known example of this is the Atlantic bluefin tuna, which I'm showing you here. In the 1970s, there was a period of high abundances and more juvenile fish were observed entering the fishery. And at one point in the stock assessment process, these abundances were classified as anomalous and those data were discarded, which made the low current population levels seem like the normal state, which is what I'm showing you here in that green circle. However, when those early data from the 1970s were re-included, the target biomass estimates increased substantially, making the current population state seem highly depleted, which is what I'm showing you here in that red circle. And this data loss is common. Those two examples that I've just mentioned, Icelandic cod and Atlantic bluefin tuna, are not the only ones. So Renee Prefontaine found that in the cases where data truncation happened, virtually all of them, 96%, resulted in lost information on extremes in spawning stock biomass, population fluctuations, and precedents in recovery or decline. And so I'd argue that rather than truncating these data, we should be striving to extend these timelines farther back in time. But this is challenging to do. So data truncation happens not for any malicious intent, but because something changes usually in the assessment process, which makes it more difficult to include data that were collected, maybe using different gears or in different ways. And so it makes it even more challenging to think about fitting diverse data like those derived from photos of fish into these existing quantitative management frameworks. And I think there's also been a lack of familiarity with and receptivity to these non-traditional data streams during this process. But this makes sense to me, thinking about the history of the field of historical ecology being relatively new. So I and others who work in this field, I think, started off asking the question, what data exists? So what data exist in archives that might tell us something about long-term change? And then when we found that information, we quantified it where we could. So we asked the question, what do they say about change? And then finally, we asked, how could this be used in management? So the process started with data exploration and ended with the management application. And so I think now, 20 years into this field, we have an opportunity to essentially flip the script and to simultaneously ask about management and history. So from the management perspective, what data could be integrated into established quantitative modeling frameworks or assessment protocols? And from the historical perspective, how can we find useful archival data that are buried in documents that were almost certainly created for an entirely different purpose? So I want to just tell you briefly about one example, a project that I've been involved with over the last couple of years that's attempting to do this. And so this is attempting to integrate historical data into management for the Atlantic bluefin tuna. I just told you a little bit about it a few minutes ago. It's a high value commercial fishery, internationally managed. The current stock assessment includes data that goes back to 1974. There was, though, a period of intensive fishing that ramped up after World War II, and especially during the 1960s, that isn't captured by the data that are included in the stock assessment. And the available data that do exist, primarily catch data, suggest that there may have been declines that happened over this time period, particularly in the 1960s, but the data so far have been too limited to really warrant inclusion. So I've been part of a partnership that is asking the question, what data could be integrated into this modeling framework for this species? And so identifying the data needs. And so I'm showing you here a graphic that shows a variety of different fisheries and gears types on the vertical axis across time and the availability of data. And so what we see here is that we have pretty good size information after 1970, but we really don't have very much before that. So one data need would be pre-1970s size information for Atlantic bluefin tuna. At the same time, we, as part of this partnership, developed the answer to the question, how do we find those data? So how do we find archival data buried in these documents created for a different purpose? And in this case, one key answer for us was the Frank Mather collection at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute Library and Archives. So Frank Mather was a tuna biologist in the 1960s and 1970s. He worked at Woods Hole, and he became concerned about declines in Atlantic bluefin tuna. He testified in front of Congress about this and was really key to developing early management for this species. He also, at this time, collected a whole lot of data for himself, and he wrote to colleagues around the Western Atlantic asking for information specifically on size. I'm showing you here one example of a document from the Mather collection. So we spent about a year and a half extracting those historical archival data and putting them into a format that matches the ways that data are entered into the stock assessment. And so doing this, we've been able to push the data window back to the 1930s. So I'm showing you here, again, that same graphic with the yellow circle indicating new data that we've been able to pull out from the Frank Mather collection, as well as a couple of other places that are fitting into this format. And so my hope here is that the analysis of this data will give us this longer term perspective on change for this population and a sense of what is natural and what we should be thinking about as natural for the future. Okay, so I want to end now with one more example of how historical data can be used and are being used to improve fisheries management, with an example that is a bit farther along, meaning that there's results in the water. For fisheries. So the problem here in South Australia has been a reduction in recreational fisheries, such as the snapper and the whiting that I'm showing you pictures of here. And this is a well-known depletion. There have been discussions about this over several decades, 30 plus years. And this is a fishery that's linked as well to an important tourism industry. One thing that's important to know about these fish is that one of their key spawning habitats is oyster reefs. So some of them spawn on oyster reefs, and others use and have used oyster reefs as juvenile nursery habitat. And those oyster reefs have been depleted in this part of the world over a couple of centuries. So Heidi Alway and Sean Connell, who were two historical ecologists based at the University of Adelaide, constructed a history of this intensive oyster fishery. It began in the 1830s, and we can see some images here of the early collection of oysters, these divers on hookah collecting oysters, and other images associated with this industry over that essentially century-long development. It crashed in 1944, and so the 1940s were the last decade that this was a viable industry. So Heidi Alway and Sean Connell collected a variety of different types of historical data on catch and on distribution through maps like this, and they were able to quantify a 99% reduction in oysters as well as a spatial restriction. So they found that historically, beds covered about 1,500 kilometers along the south coast of Australia. And the process of integrating historical data into fisheries management here, I think, is an example of a real bright spot. So the folks involved in this work did a lot of additional work communicating the fact that historical oyster reef loss was linked to the habitat losses effects on these recreational fisheries. At this time, there was a funded government mandate to improve recreational fishing. So something like $3 million had been allocated, but the pathway for that hadn't been identified. And through these series of iterative conversations and meetings, public buy-in was achieved as for oyster reefs as a solution to this decline, this noted decline of recreational fisheries. So this restoration work is underway. So the Windara Reef was the first reef that was rebuilt off the coast of South Australia. This was a location identified as a place of a historical oyster reef. The name was chosen by school children in this area, and it's the name of the indigenous reef that was previously in this place. And so this is work that began here and is expanding throughout the rest of Australia with something like 60 sites identified as places to rebuild in the future. And Heidi Alway, who's been involved in this work, said, restoration seems to have been almost a bit of a circuit breaker. So in comparison to what's been tried over the last 3 or 4 decades, these ideas seem to have prompted new thinking and new approaches. So we can see here with this final example, I think, that historical ecology can help to restore cultural memory and guide recovery. So we started off by thinking about the question of what species are natural, then moving to thinking about what abundances are natural. And then finally, in this last example, I think the questions become more nuanced. And in this case, the question of what were natural ecological links, so the link between oyster reef habitat and the abundances of targeted recreational fish. And then how can these be restored to achieve policy goals, and how can stakeholders be brought into that process? So in conclusion, the problem I think that cuts across these different places and examples is that cultural memory is really linked to future goals. Across these different examples, we see different degrees of memory playing into the discussions around what we want and what we should have in these coastal ecosystems in the future. And across the board, memories tend to be short, on the order of a generation. And so even in cases of dramatic, well-known change, like the North Atlantic, where the history of cod is really present, I think history is still needed, and the reminder of how these ecosystems have changed is one that we can't have too much of. And I think going forward, now that we're 2 decades into this field, I think the thing that I'm most excited about is the ways that we can apply these data. So I think there's examples of how baselines can be codified into expectations for species, for abundances of particular species, and for community interactions. And I think the examples that we have so far are really highlighting the fact that stakeholder engagement and stakeholder buy-in is really important to this process. And then finally, I think a somewhat unexpected or surprising outcome is that historical perspectives are important not just for baselines, but also for creative thinking. I think particularly this example from South Australia shows us that they can trigger new and creative solutions to environmental problems. And I think that's also something that we'll need a whole lot of going forward. So thank you very much for the honor of presenting today, and I look forward to the conversation we'll have next.